The lawyer arrived on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after Margaret died. I was in the kitchen washing the breakfast dishes, the ones from the set Margaret had owned since 1978, the ones with the small blue flowers around the rim that she had always called her good dishes, even though she used them every day. When I heard the knock at the front door, I was not expecting anyone. My mother Susan had called the night before to say she and my sister Diane would be coming on Thursday to start going through things, which was how she had described the process of sorting through 81 years of a woman's life. The phrasing had bothered me in a way I could not immediately name. Start going through things? Like Margaret's house was a storage unit that needed clearing. The lawyer's name was Thomas Hale. He was in his early 60s, gray at the temples, with the specific bearing of a man who had spent 30 years delivering information in rooms where the information was complicated. He showed me his card. He said he had been retained by Margaret Holloway 18 months ago and had been instructed to make contact 9 days after her death. He said he had documents that required my attention. He said, "Is there somewhere we could sit down?" Welcome back to Still Standing Stories. We're the women who showed up when no one else would finally find out what showing up was worth. If you have ever been the one who stayed while everyone else found reasons to be elsewhere, this story is for you. Subscribe before we go further, because what Thomas Hale put on Margaret's kitchen table that Tuesday morning is something I have spent 4 years unknowingly earning, and I want to take you through every one of those years before I tell you what it was. My name is Grace Holloway. I'm 34 years old and I am a hospice nurse in Nashville, Tennessee. I work with people at the end of their lives, which means I'm familiar with the specific quality of time that exists near a death. The way days slow down and become very precise. The way small things accumulate, meaning they would not have had before. The way a person's true character becomes legible in the final months in a way it sometimes is not when there's still plenty of time to perform a different version of themselves. I chose hospice nursing because I believed it was important work. I also chose it because Margaret was a hospice nurse for 22 years, and she was the person I most wanted to be like when I grew up. Margaret Eleanor Holloway was my father's mother. She was born in 1942 in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the daughter of a coal miner and a school teacher, and she had spent her life doing the kind of work that does not get recognized until it is gone, the kind of work that holds things together quietly and that everyone benefits from and that no one thinks to name while it is happening. She had married my grandfather William in 1963, and they had 2 children, my father David, who died of a heart attack when I was 19, and my uncle Robert, who still lived in Knoxville and who I spoke to every few weeks. My father's death was the event that reorganized everything. Before it, we were a family that functioned, not without friction, but with the basic goodwill of people who have enough in common to maintain a relationship without too much effort. After it, the family sorted itself, the way families sort in the aftermath of loss, into the people who showed up and the people who were busy. My mother Susan and my sister Diane were, in the years after my father died, largely busy. Not entirely. They came to the memorial, they called on holidays, they attended the milestones, but the texture of presence, the regular contact, the checking in, the appearing without being called, was not something they did for Margaret. Margaret was my father's mother, which meant she was, in my mother's implicit taxonomy, less hers to care for. I was 25 when I started driving to Margaret's house on weekends. Not because anyone asked me to, because I missed my father, and Margaret was the person who remembered him most fully, who could tell me things about who he had been before I knew him. I started going for myself, and I stayed because Margaret needed someone to stay. The first year was easy. She was 77, healthy, sharp, still gardening and reading and hosting her book club on the second Thursday of every month. The weekends were not about care yet. They were about company. We cooked together and worked in the garden and watched old movies and talked about everything. She told me about my father as a boy. I told her about nursing school, about the patients I was learning to hold. We were in those early months, simply 2 people who had found each other at the right time. By the second year, the ease had begun to require more maintenance. Margaret's knee was troubling her, and the garden was becoming difficult, and the appointments were multiplying. The cardiologist, the orthopedist, the pharmacist who had to be navigated because she was on 7 medications that needed to be monitored for interactions. I learned her medical history the way I had learned my patients' histories. thoroughly because thorough was the only way to be useful. I started going twice a month and then every weekend, and then, in the third year when the falls began, I was there every Saturday and sometimes Sunday, and sometimes I called on Wednesday evenings just to make sure. My mother Susan knew I was going. She called it sweet, the way you call something sweet when you have decided it is not your responsibility but you want to appear to approve of it. She said Margaret was lucky to have me. She said I had always been the compassionate one in the family. She said these things in the tone of someone crediting someone else for a job they have decided not to do themselves. Diane was more direct. She said Margaret seemed fine whenever she visited. She visited at Christmas, and on Margaret's birthday, 2 days a year. And that she did not understand why I was driving 2 hours round trip every weekend when Margaret had perfectly good neighbors. I said the neighbors were not responsible for making sure her medications were refilled, or that her knee was being managed properly. Diane said I needed to maintain perspective. I said I was the one who knew what her blood pressure was running that month. Diane said I was catastrophizing. This was the pattern. The more present I became, the less necessary my presence seemed to everyone else, because my presence was absorbing the evidence that it was necessary. Stay with me, because I need to tell you about what the 4 years actually looked like from the inside, because the summary compresses something that deserves to be described. The third year was the year everything changed. I want to tell you about the third year specifically, because the third year was the year I understood what the work actually was and what it required, and because I think the people who have been in similar situations will recognize it. The third year was the year of the insurance company. I mentioned it briefly, and I want to give it its full weight, because it is the most concrete example I have of the kind of work that is invisible to people who are not doing it. Margaret's physical therapy had been approved by her insurer for 8 sessions following her second fall. She completed 6 sessions. The insurer then determined that she had reached maximum therapeutic benefit, a determination made without examination, based on a chart review by someone who had never met her, and denied coverage for the final 2 sessions and for the follow-up evaluation that her physical therapist had recommended. The physical therapist said the denial was standard and that families could appeal, but that the appeals process was lengthy and most people did not pursue it. She said it in the tone of someone who has given this information many times and has watched most families absorb the denial and move on. I was not most families. I spent 2 weekends researching the appeals process. I read Margaret's insurance policy cover to cover 87 pages, the specific language governing rehabilitation coverage, and the criteria for determining maximum therapeutic benefit, and the procedure for requesting an independent medical review. I found 3 provisions that I believe the insurer had not correctly applied. I wrote a letter citing each provision, with the specific language of the policy alongside the specific facts of Margaret's case, and I submitted it with a supporting letter from her physical therapist and a letter from her cardiologist explaining why continued physical therapy was medically indicated given her cardiovascular history. The appeal took 4 months. The insurer denied the first appeal. I filed a second appeal requesting an independent medical review, which the policy specified was available at the claimant's request. The independent reviewer, who was a board-certified physiatrist, overturned the denial. 2 physical therapy sessions and a follow-up evaluation. The dollar value was perhaps $800. The time I spent on the appeals process was, by conservative estimate, 20 hours. No one asked me to do this. No one thanked me when it was resolved. Margaret said good with the satisfaction of someone who had expected me to succeed and was confirmed. My mother did not know it had happened. I want to tell you this specific story because I think it illustrates what I mean when I say the work was invisible. Not just to my family, to the healthcare system, to the insurer, to everyone except Margaret and her physical therapist, who knew what the appeal had required and who said, when it was resolved, that most families did not have someone like me. Most families did not have someone like me because most families did not have someone who was there every weekend and who learned the insurance policy and who spent 20 hours on an appeal for $800 because the principle mattered and because Margaret deserved the care she was owed. I was there. That was all. But being there, consistently and completely, is a form of advocacy that is not replicable by distance. My mother could not have filed that appeal from Boca Raton. Not because she lacked the intelligence. Susan is a capable woman, but because filing the appeal required the knowledge that only comes from being present in a person's medical life. You have to know the history to use the history. You have to be there to know the history. I was there. I knew the history. I used it. Margaret had a fall in October. Not a serious one. She caught herself on the counter and bruised her hip, but did not break anything. But it was the first fall, and the first fall is always a marker. In hospice, we talk about the first fall as a threshold event. Not necessarily the beginning of the end, but the beginning of a different kind of attention. I started going every weekend without exception. I reorganized her medications into a weekly pill organizer and set alarms on her phone for the ones she was most likely to forget. I installed grab bars in the bathroom, not a difficult installation, but one that required 3 visits to the hardware store and 2 hours on a Saturday when I could have been anywhere else. I asked her about advanced directives and she told me she had had them since 1995 and they were in the fireproof box in the hall closet, and then she showed me where the key was. She also showed me other things. Her important documents, the deed to the house, the bank information, the insurance policies. She showed me these things with the specific methodical care of a woman who had spent 22 years as a hospice nurse and understood exactly what it meant to be organized at the end of a life. She had watched families search for documents in the weeks after a death, and she had decided decades ago that she would not put anyone through that. When the time comes, she said, showing me the fireproof box, you will know where everything is. I thought she was telling me this because I was the one who would be doing the practical work of the aftermath. I was right about that. I did not yet know the full dimensions of what I was right about. My mother called in November of the 3rd year. She had heard about the grab bars, from whom I was not sure, possibly from Margaret herself, who mentioned things without always registering how they would land with Susan. She said she was concerned that I was enabling dependency by making Margaret's house more accessible. She said it would be better for Margaret to move somewhere that had proper care. I said the grab bars cost $40. Susan said it was the principle. The principle, as I came to understand it over the subsequent months, was that my investment in Margaret's ability to stay in her own home was inconvenient for a plan that had not been stated explicitly, but that was clearly forming. Margaret's house was worth, by current Nashville area estimates, somewhere between $400,000 and $450,000. This number had been mentioned in at least 3 separate phone calls over the course of the 4 years. Not directly, not as, we want to sell Margaret's house. But in the context of the market right now and what these older homes are going for, and Margaret must feel the upkeep is a lot. The upkeep was not a lot because I was handling it. I want to be precise about what I was doing in those 4 years, because I think the word helping is too small for it. Helping implies occasional, implies above and beyond, implies something extra layered on top of a system that functions without it. What I was doing was not extra, what I was doing was the system. I was the person who took Margaret to her quarterly cardiology appointments and sat in the room and listened and wrote down what the doctor said, because Margaret, who had been a nurse for 22 years and who was sharper than most people half her age, still sometimes could not hold all the information at once when the doctor was also her doctor. I was the person who reconciled her bank statements every month because her eyes were making reading difficult and she did not want to admit it, and the bank had tried to charge her twice for the same overdraft fee the previous spring. I was the person who talked to her insurance company when they denied the home physical therapy she needed after the second fall. A phone call that lasted 40 minutes and that required me to cite 2 specific provisions of her policy and to escalate twice, and that resulted in the denial being reversed. I was also the person who sat with her on Saturday evenings when the light went golden through the kitchen windows, and she talked about William and about my father and about what it had been like to be a hospice nurse in the years when the field was still being defined, when the understanding of what dying people needed was still being built from the ground up by people who showed up and paid attention and figured it out. I was the person who carried her garden tools home at the end of the season and stored them in my apartment and brought them back in spring because she could no longer manage the back and forth, and because the garden mattered to her in a way that was not about the garden but about being the person who had tended this specific plot of earth for 30 years and who was not ready to stop. The garden gloves lived in my apartment. They were the only things of hers that came home with me. I did not take them because I wanted them. I took them because they needed to be somewhere dry, and that somewhere happened to be wherever I was. In December of the 4th year, 4 months before Margaret died, I want to tell you about the 4th Saturday in March because it was the last Saturday before Margaret died, and because I did not know at the time that it was the last, and because the not knowing is part of what I want to tell you. It was an ordinary Saturday. I arrived at 9, which was when I usually arrived, and Margaret was already up and making tea, which she was still able to do independently on good mornings. And we sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and talked about the garden, which was not yet fully awake but was showing the first signs. The forsythia had bloomed the week before, and the hydrangeas were beginning to put out leaves along the south fence. She was tired that morning in a way she had been tired for several months, not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed anyone who was not paying close attention, but with a quality of fatigue that I recognized from work. The body beginning to slow its work, the systems beginning their gradual negotiation. We did not talk about anything significant. We talked about the forsythia and about a book she was reading, a novel about a family in Scotland that she said was slow but worth the slowness. We talked about a colleague of mine whose patient had died the week before, in a way that had been particularly peaceful, and Margaret listened the way she always listened to my work stories, with the full attention of someone who had done this work and understood it and was glad there were still people doing it. Around noon I made us lunch, soup from a can, which was not what we usually had but which was what was available, and which Margaret ate without complaint, which was itself a kind of signal to me that I filed without fully reading it. After lunch she was tired and I helped her to the recliner in the living room and she fell asleep with the book on her lap, and I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed her medication schedule for the following week and made a list of what needed to be refilled. I left at 3. She woke up when I was getting my coat, as she always did, with the specific alertness of someone who had been listening even while sleeping. She said, "Same time next week." I said, "Same time next week." She said, "Don't forget the forsythia." I said, "I won't forget the forsythia." She said she needed to be cut back after blooming or she would be leggy by summer. I did not forget the forsythia. I went back the following Saturday and cut it back with the pruning shears I had learned, in the 2nd year, to find in the 3rd drawer of the tool bench in the garage. Margaret was not there to supervise because by the following Saturday she had been admitted to the hospice unit and was not coming back to the house. She died on a Thursday. The forsythia was cut back correctly. The hydrangeas were showing good leaf. The garden was going to be fine. I went back to the house the day after she died, and I sat in the kitchen for 2 hours without doing anything. Then I got up and I watered the plants on the windowsill, because someone had to, because they did not know she was gone and they were thirsty and they were mine to take care of now. I did not know yet that they were legally mine to take care of. I knew it the way I had always known things about Margaret's house, in the body without being told, from being there. Something shifted in how she talked to me. Not dramatically. She had always talked to me directly, without the softening that some older people use with younger family members. But in December there was a quality of finality to some of our conversations that I recognized from work. The quality of someone who is sorting through what matters and making sure it is said. She talked about the house, about the summer she and William had bought it, 1971, about the specific circumstances of the purchase, which involved a loan from his parents and a negotiation with the seller that William had conducted over 3 separate conversations and which had produced a price $50 below the asking that Margaret still considered one of the great victories of their early life together. She talked about the garden, about what she had planted where and why, about the hydrangeas along the south fence that bloomed every July without fail, and that she wanted someone to keep up with, because they had been planted the summer my father was born. She said, "You know this house." I said, "I know this house." She said, "Good. I want someone who knows it to have it." I did not ask what she meant. I did not press. In hospice, you learn not to press when someone is saying the things they need to say. You learn to receive what is offered and to trust that more will come when more is ready. More came on a Sunday in January. She asked me to drive her somewhere. She would not say where until we were in the car, and she gave me an address I did not recognize, a law office on a street near downtown Nashville. I found parking. She went in and I waited in the car for 45 minutes. When she came out, she looked lighter. Not happy exactly. "Settled," she said. "I've done what I needed to do, now we can go have lunch." We had lunch. She ordered the chicken salad, which she always ordered. We talked about whether the hydrangeas would need to be cut back before spring. She died in April. Her heart, which had been quietly failing for 2 years, stopped on a Thursday morning. The hospice team, not mine, she had been admitted to a different service to avoid the conflict of interest, said it had been peaceful. I drove to the house that morning, and I sat in the kitchen, and I looked at the garden through the window, and I thought, she knew. She always knew. That is what 22 years of hospice nursing gives you, the knowledge of the shape of things. I want to tell you about Thomas Hale now, about the Tuesday morning, about what he put on the kitchen table, because the story has been moving toward this, and it is time to get there. He sat across from me at Margaret's kitchen table, the one she had bought at an estate sale in 1983, and which had a burn mark on the left corner from a candle that had tipped over at a dinner party in 1991. A burn mark she had always covered with a small trivet rather than refinish the table, because she said the burn was part of the table's history now. He set his briefcase on the chair beside him. He took out a folder. The folder was thick. Not as thick as the one Nora Caldwell's grandmother had prepared. I have heard that story. I think most people in families like mine have heard something like that story, but substantial. Maybe 40 pages. Organized with tabs. Thomas said, "Your grandmother retained my firm 18 months ago. She came in alone, she was extremely clear about what she wanted, and she was, in my professional judgment, and in the judgment of the independent physician who evaluated her at her request, in full possession of her faculties. I want to be clear about that before we discuss anything else." I said, "Okay." He said, "She told me she wanted you to have this at the table, in her house, with the folder open, so you could read it in the place it referred to. She was specific about that." I looked at the table, at the burn mark under the trivet, at the kitchen through the window where the hydrangeas were just beginning to show green. Thomas opened the folder. "Stay with me. I need to tell you about my family's plan before I tell you what was in the folder, because the plan is the context and the context matters. My mother Susan had called the day after Margaret died. Not to check on me, to discuss logistics. She used the word logistics. She said there were a lot of decisions to make and that she and Diane had been talking and they thought it made sense to move quickly on the house because the market was favorable. She said they would need to sort through Margaret's things and that it would be easiest if we could do it over a single weekend so no one had to make multiple trips. I said, "Mom, she died yesterday." She said, "I know, sweetheart. I'm just thinking about the practical side." The practical side was this. Margaret's house, by the realtor's estimate that I learned had already been solicited before Margaret died, while she was in hospice, solicited by my mother, was worth $430,000. My mother's plan, which she had outlined to Diane, and which Diane had mentioned to me in a call that I do not think was intended to be as revealing as it was to sell the house quickly, divide the proceeds between herself and my Uncle Robert as Margaret's surviving children, and use the money to fund a renovation of the condo in Boca Raton where she spent winters. There had been no conversation about what Margaret wanted. There had been no conversation about whether there was a will. There had been an assumption, the specific assumption of people who have not been paying attention, that the situation would sort itself according to default. Default meaning, 2 children, equal shares, house gets sold. Diane had mentioned in the call that was more revealing than intended, that she thought Grace had probably gotten too attached to the house because of all the time she spent there, and that it might be difficult for me emotionally, but that it was important to remember that the house was an asset, not a home. It was Margaret's home. She had lived there for 50 years. I want to tell you about the morning of the family meeting that had been scheduled for Thursday. The meeting where my mother and Diane were going to start going through things. It was the morning Thomas Hale knocked on the door. I had not told my mother he was coming. I had not known he was coming. He had sent a letter to the house address which I had been receiving Margaret's mail, and which I had not yet opened because it was addressed to Margaret and I had not yet arrived at the place of being ready to open her mail. He knocked at 8:15. My mother and Diane were not expected until noon. This was not an accident. I believe Margaret knew, with the precision of a woman who had spent 4 years watching me navigate her family, and who understood its dynamics better than anyone, that I would need time alone with the folder before the family arrived. She had set the timing accordingly. Thomas Hale opened the folder on Margaret's kitchen table, and he walked me through what was in it. The house was in a trust. Margaret had transferred the deed into the Margaret E. Holloway Revocable Living Trust 18 months ago. On the same day, she had gone to Thomas's office and signed everything. The trust named me as the successor trustee. Upon Margaret's death, which had now occurred, control of the house passed to me. Not to my mother. Not split between my mother and Uncle Robert. To me. Thomas also showed me the durable power of attorney she had executed, naming me as her agent for financial and healthcare decisions. He showed me the physician's evaluation, signed by her neurologist, confirming full capacity at the time of signing. He showed me the amendment to her will that she had made at the same time, which confirmed the trust arrangement and which left her personal property, the furniture, the garden tools, the kitchen dishes with the small blue flowers, to me as well, with specific instruction that the hydrangeas along the south fence be maintained. He showed me one more thing, a handwritten letter, 2 pages, in Margaret's handwriting, which I recognized as the handwriting of her good years, clear, controlled, the specific cursive of a woman who had been educated when cursive was taught as a discipline. Dear Grace, it began. If you're reading this at the kitchen table, which I have asked Thomas to ensure you are, then I have done what I set out to do. I want to explain why. I have watched you come to this house every weekend for 4 years. I have watched you learn where everything is, and what everything means, and how to manage every part of this life that I am no longer fully able to manage myself. I have watched you do this without complaint, and without expectation, and without the particular quality of attention that people give when they want to be noticed giving it. You came because you wanted to come. That is the rarest thing. I have also watched your mother and your sister. I want to be fair to them. They are not bad people. They are people who made choices about where to put their time and attention. And they chose not to put it here, and I understand that people make these choices and that the choices do not define them entirely. But they do define something, and what they define in this case is who knew this house and who loved it and who has earned the right to decide what happens to it. You know this house. You have kept the garden and fixed the grab bars and refilled the medications and argued with the insurance company and sat at this table on Saturday evenings and listened to me talk about William and about your father and about the work that I believe we were both called to do. You have done all of this, and you have not asked for anything in return, and that is precisely why I'm giving you everything. I do not leave the house to punish Susan. I leave it to you because you are the person I want to have it. There is a difference. I hope you understand the difference. The garden gloves are wherever you put them for the winter. The hydrangeas will need to be cut back by 2/3 in late fall. The burn mark on the table corner came from a candle at the dinner party where your father met your mother in 1983. I have always thought that was a good reason to keep it. I love you. Take care of the house. Take care of the garden. And when Susan tries to make this about something other than what it is, and she will, I know her, remember that you do not have to justify receiving something that was freely given. All my love, Margaret. I read the letter twice, then I folded it and put it back in the folder. Then I made Thomas a cup of coffee, and we sat at Margaret's kitchen table, and I asked him to walk me through everything again from the beginning, so I understood it completely. He walked me through it, the trust, the power of attorney, the physician's letter, the will, the specific legal architecture that Margaret had built, carefully and alone, in the 18 months between her visit to his office and her death. The architecture that ensured the house would go where she intended it to go and that no one without her consent could redirect it. She was, Thomas said, finishing his coffee, one of the most organized clients I have had in 30 years. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she made sure it was airtight. I thought about 22 years of hospice nursing, about knowing what the end looks like and deciding to get everything in order before it arrives, about the specific competence of a woman who had spent her career making sure other people's final affairs were as clean as possible, and who had applied that same competence to her own. She had known. She had always known. My mother arrived at noon. I want to tell you about what happened in the days between Thomas Hale's visit and my mother's arrival, because there were 3 days and the 3 days were not empty. I stayed at the house. Not because I needed to. I had my own apartment in Nashville, 20 minutes away, but because the house needed someone in it, and I was the right person to be there, and because there is a specific quality of a house in the days after its occupant has died that requires a kind of tending that is not about maintenance. The plants need water. The mail needs to be brought in. The thermostat needs to be set because the house has a temperature it wants to be at, and no one is there to want it anymore. These are small things. They add up to a presence that the house requires. I read the letter 4 more times in those 3 days, not because I did not understand it. I understood it completely from the first reading, but because there are things that need to be read multiple times before they settle into the body the way they need to settle. Before they become knowledge rather than information, the sentences I kept returning to were the ones about watching. She had been watching me come for 4 years, and she had noticed the quality of attention. The specific absence of performance in what I was doing, the fact that I came without an audience, without anyone to witness the coming. The grab bars and the insurance appeals and the medication reconciliations had all happened in the kitchen or the bathroom or on the phone in the car on the way home, not in a way that anyone could observe and confirm and credit. They happened because they needed to happen, and I was there. She had been the only witness, and she had written it down. On the second day, I went through the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, the room she had used as an office since William died, the room that contained 30 years of organized records. Everything was labeled. Everything was dated. The medical records were in a separate binder, organized by provider, with the most recent on top. The financial records were similarly organized with tabs for banking, insurance, utilities, and taxes. The legal documents were in a separate folder, not the one Thomas had delivered, but the supporting documents, the ones that predated the trust by years. She had been organized for a long time. Not because she was preparing to die, she had been organized since William died in 2001, because she had watched him be organized and had decided that this was something you did for the people who would come after you. She had done it for me. She had not known in 2001 that it would be me specifically, but she had done it for whoever was going to be there, and whoever was going to be there turned out to be me. I found in the filing cabinet a folder labeled Grace. It was thin, 3 items, a copy of her will from 1998, predating the trust, a card, a birthday card from 4 years ago, the first year I had started coming on weekends, signed with her looping M, and a photograph. A photograph I had not known existed, Margaret and my father at the kitchen table, both of them laughing at something out of frame, taken in what looked like the late 1980s, based on the glasses my father was wearing. I did not know anyone had taken this photograph. I did not know it existed. It had been in a folder labeled with my name in a filing cabinet in Margaret's office for at least 4 years, possibly longer, waiting to be found. I held it for a long time. I put it in my bag to take home. Then I thought, no, this photograph belongs in this house. The house is mine now. The photograph stays. I put it on the windowsill in the kitchen, propped against the clay pot where she grew herbs in the spring. My father at the kitchen table, laughing. In the house where he had grown up. In the house that is now mine. This is what showing up gives you. Not just the house, the photograph, the specific things that only exist if you are the person who is there to find them. She came with Diane and with 2 large empty boxes, which she had brought for the purpose of beginning to sort through things. I had been sitting with the folder on the table for 3.5 hours. The coffee cups had been washed and put away. The trivet was in its place over the burn mark. Susan came in through the front door with the ease of someone who has decided a space is available to them. She looked around the living room in the way people look around rooms they are assessing. She said, the place could use a good airing out. She said she had the number of a realtor she trusted. I said, Mom, before we do anything else, I need to show you something. She looked at the folder on the table. She sat down. I did not present the documents dramatically. I did not want drama. I laid them out the way Thomas had laid them out, in order, one at a time, with brief explanation of what each one was. The trust deed, the power of attorney, the physician's letter, the will amendment. I left the letter for last. Diane said, while I was going through the trust deed, where did that come from? I said, Margaret had it prepared 18 months ago. Susan said, she never mentioned anything like this. I said no, She mentioned it to Thomas Hale and to her neurologist and to me on a Sunday in January when I drove her to his office and waited in the car. Susan looked at me. Something moved across her face. Not anger yet. Not the anger that would come later, but something more preliminary. Recognition, maybe, of the shape of what was happening. I put the physician's letter on the table. I said, she was evaluated the same day she signed everything. Full capacity confirmed. It's on medical letterhead. Diane said, this doesn't seem legal. I said, Thomas Hale's number is on his card in the folder. He's available to answer questions. Then I put the letter on the table. I said, she left a personal letter. I'm going to read it to you. I read it, not performing it, reading it, the way I had read it to myself twice that morning, at the pace of someone making sure every word lands where it was intended. I read the part about watching them. I read the part about people making choices. I read the part about the difference between leaving the house to me and punishing Susan. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Susan's response took about 30 seconds to arrive. When it came in the particular register of a woman who is prepared for a situation she did not know she was preparing for. She said the house had been in the family and that family meant all of them, and that Margaret had clearly been influenced, and that she wanted to speak to a lawyer. I said, of course. Thomas's number is on the card. She said, I mean my own lawyer. I said, that's absolutely you're right. Diane said, you knew about this, you drove her to the lawyer. I said I drove her to an address she gave me and I waited in the car. I didn't know what she was doing until this morning. This was true. I want to be clear that it was true, because I think the people who know families like mine will wonder. I had not known. I had known in the way that you know things you have not yet been told that Margaret was settling something. I had not known the specific shape of what she was settling. Diane said, and you're just going to take it. I looked at her. I said, she gave it to me. I'm going to honor her wishes, Susan said, after everything I've done for that woman. I did not ask her to finish the sentence. Some sentences are better left unfinished. What happened in the following weeks was not simple, and it was not clean, but it was less dramatic than I had expected. My mother consulted a lawyer. The lawyer told her, more or less what Thomas had told me, that Margaret had executed everything correctly, that the capacity evaluation was thorough and current, that challenging the trust would be expensive and unlikely to succeed, and would almost certainly produce the opposite of the reconciliation that Susan said she wanted. My Uncle Robert called from Knoxville. He said he had known about the trust. Margaret had told him 6 months after she set it up, because she wanted at least one of her children to know, and she knew Robert would hold it without drama. He said he thought it was right. He said Margaret had told him I was the only one who really knew the house. He said he hoped Susan and I could find a way through it. Susan and I have not yet found a way through it. This is not because I have refused. I have tried to have the conversations that might lead somewhere, the kind that require both people to acknowledge hard things. What is required from Susan's side is something she is not yet ready to give, which is the acknowledgement that her absence from Margaret's life over 4 years was a choice that had consequences, and that the consequences were not unfair. Diane called me 3 weeks after the reading. She did not apologize. She said she understood I was probably angry. I said I was not angry. She said that was hard to believe given the circumstances. I said I had been given a house by a woman who loved me, and I was sad that she was gone and the house was not the part I was thinking about most. This was true. The house is real and the house matters, and I am going to take care of it the way Margaret wanted it taken care of. But what I think about most is not the house. It is the letter. It is the specific sentences about watching me come every weekend and about the quality of attention that people give when they want to be noticed giving it, and about what it meant to her that I came because I wanted to come. I did want to come. I want to be clear about that because I think there is a version of this story where the weekend visits look like investment, like a campaign, like 4 years of showing up in order to receive something at the end. That is not what they were. I drove to Margaret's house every weekend because she was my father's mother, And because she was my friend, and because I had chosen, 4 years ago, to be the kind of person who shows up. The garden gloves are in my apartment. They will go back to the garden in spring. The hydrangeas need to be cut back by 2/3 in late fall. I have written it in my calendar. The burn mark on the table corner is still there, still covered by the trivet. In the house that is now mine, and that I will take care of the way she took care of it, which is to say with the specific love of someone who knows where everything is, and what everything means, and why the details are worth preserving. The house knows me. I have known it for 4 years. Now it is mine to know for as long as I take care of it. That is what showing up is worth. Not what you receive at the end, though what I received is real and significant, and I do not minimize it. What it is worth is the showing up itself, the 4 years of Saturday mornings and medication, reconciliations and arguments with insurance companies and garden work, and Saturday evenings with the light going golden through the kitchen window. What it is worth is the letter on the table that said, "You came because you wanted to come. I came because I wanted to come. I would have come anyway, but it is good to know that she knew." I want to tell you about Robert, because he is the third adult in this story, and because what he said to me matters, and because I have not given him his full place yet. Robert Holloway is 62 years old. He is a retired high school history teacher who lives in Knoxville with his wife of 31 years and 2 dogs, whose names I can never remember correctly. He is not a dramatic person. He is the kind of person who says what he thinks in clear sentences and then does not say it again, because he has already said it once and that should be sufficient. He called me the day after Thomas's visit. I do not know who had told him Thomas had been there, possibly Thomas himself, who had been in contact with Robert in the weeks before Margaret died. He said, "I know about the trust. I've known for 6 months." I said, "Margaret told you?" He said, "She called me in October. She said she had arranged things the way she wanted them arranged, and she wanted me to know so there wouldn't be confusion after. She said Grace is getting the house." He said, "I told her I thought that was right." I said, "You didn't object?" He said, "Object? I've watched you drive down here every weekend for 4 years. What's to object to?" He paused. "Your mother is going to be difficult." I said, "I know," he said. "Don't let her make you feel like you took something. You didn't take anything. Mom gave it." He said one more thing before he hung up. He said, "She told me something else when she called in October. She said the reason she was leaving the house to you wasn't because of the work you did, though she was grateful for the work. She said the reason was that you understood what the house was for. She said, Grace knows a house is for living in, not for selling." I have thought about that sentence many times since October. A house is for living in, not for selling. Margaret spent 50 years in that house. She raised 2 children in it. She grew a garden in the backyard that she tended for 30 years. She put a prism above the kitchen sink that threw rainbows across the floor every morning. She kept a burn mark on the table corner because the burn mark was part of the table's history. She knew what the house was for. She knew I knew too. Robert came to Nashville in May after the legal matters had been resolved. We had dinner at the kitchen table, the same burn mark, the same trivet. He brought a bottle of wine and we drank it slowly and talked about Margaret and about my father and about the history of a family told through the rooms of a house. He said, "She would have liked this." I said, "She would have had opinions about the wine." He laughed. He said Margaret had always had opinions about wine, that it was one of the things she had developed opinions about in her 70s, because she had decided there was no point in not developing opinions when you were old enough to trust them. I have been developing my own opinions slowly about what it means to be the person who takes care of something. Not the labor of it, I understood the labor before this. The meaning of it. The specific kind of belonging that comes from knowing where everything is and what everything means and why the details matter. Margaret gave me that. Not just the house. The understanding of what a house is. It is the place you know in your body. The place where you do not have to think about where the pruning shears are because your hands already know. The place where the light at 3 in the afternoon falls in a specific way that you have come to rely on without knowing you relied on it. The place where the burn mark on the table corner is not a flaw but a record of something real that happened here. That is what a house is for. I'm living in it, taking care of it, learning it more deeply every week. The garden gloves are back in the garage. Spring is here. The hydrangeas along the south fence are exactly where they should be. I want to say something about hospice nursing and what it taught me about this situation, because the two things are connected in ways that I have been thinking about since April. Hospice nursing teaches you to see clearly, not in the way of clinical detachment. Hospice nurses are not detached. We are in fact the opposite of detached. We are trained to be fully present to what is happening in a way that is specifically uncomfortable and specifically necessary. What I mean by seeing clearly is being able to look at a situation and understand what it actually is, rather than what would be more comfortable to believe it is. What I saw clearly in the 4 years of going to Margaret's house was what the family actually was, not in a harsh way, not as a condemnation, but as an accurate account of who was present and who was absent and what the presence and absence meant. My mother loved Margaret in the way that people love obligations, with genuine feeling underlying a fundamental unwillingness to be inconvenienced. Diane loved Margaret in the way that people love pleasant memories. She visited on birthdays and holidays, when Margaret was her best self, when the house was clean and the visit could be kept to a manageable length. These are real forms of love. They are also insufficient forms, when what is needed is the kind of love that shows up on an unremarkable Saturday when nothing significant is happening, and the person just needs someone there. I showed up on the unremarkable Saturdays. I showed up when Margaret was tired, and when the medications needed to be reconciled, and when the insurance company needed to be argued with. I showed up because I wanted to, and because it was right, and because I had enough of my father in me to understand that some things cannot be done remotely or intermittently, or on a schedule that puts the visitor's convenience above the person being visited. What hospice also teaches you is that people at the end of their lives become very clear about what mattered. The performances fall away. The things that were maintained for social reasons become too expensive to maintain. What is left is what was always true. What was always true about Margaret was that she valued presence over gesture, reliability over occasional grand showing up, the specific texture of relationship that comes from someone knowing where you keep the pruning shears. She chose accordingly. She had been watching for 4 years, and she had seen clearly, and she had made a document that said, "I see you. I know what you have done. This is mine to give, and I'm giving it to you." I have been a hospice nurse for 9 years. I have been present at many deaths. I have learned that what people want at the end is to know that the things they built will be tended after they go, that the garden will be watered, that the hydrangeas will be cut back properly, that someone who knows the house will live in the house and take care of it, the way it deserves to be taken care of. I know this house. I will take care of it. That is what she gave me. Not just the title, the responsibility. And the responsibility is the thing I value most. In June, I had a patient at the hospice, an 83-year-old woman named Eleanor, a retired school teacher with 3 children who visited on a rotating schedule, each of them dutiful. Each of them slightly uncomfortable in the specific way of people fulfilling an obligation they believe is important, without quite knowing how to be fully present in it. There was a granddaughter. She came on Tuesdays every week, with flowers from her own garden and 2 hours carved out of whatever the rest of her week required. She sat beside Eleanor's bed and held her hand and talked about ordinary things, her own garden, a book she was reading, a funny thing that had happened at work. Eleanor's face changed when the granddaughter arrived. Something that had been slightly guarded went soft. I watched this for 4 weeks. On the day Eleanor died, the granddaughter was there. She arrived at 7 in the morning and she did not leave, and she was holding Eleanor's hand when it happened. The 3 children arrived an hour later, apologetic about the traffic, full of the particular grief of people who had meant to be there and had not been. I did not say anything to them about what I had witnessed over 4 weeks. It was not my place to say it. But I thought, watching the granddaughter in the hallway while the family gathered, Eleanor knew. She had been watching too. I hope Eleanor had a folder. I hope there was a Thomas Hale and a kitchen table and a letter that said, "You came because you wanted to come." I hope the granddaughter found it. I hope she was sitting at the kitchen table when she did, with the garden visible through the window and the ordinary objects of someone's life arranged around her, and the understanding arriving quietly that what she had given freely had been received and held and returned. That is the shape of the thing. That is what I want you to understand. Not the legal mechanics, though. The legal mechanics matter, and Margaret understood them completely and used them with precision. The shape underneath the mechanics. The shape that says, someone was watching, someone knew, someone prepared months and years in advance to say so. She prepared for 18 months. She drove herself to Thomas Hale's office, and she sat in his conference room, and she told him what she wanted and why she wanted it, and she was evaluated by her neurologist on the same day, and the evaluation confirmed what anyone who had spent 4 minutes with her would have known, which was that Margaret Eleanor Holloway knew exactly what she was doing. She knew what she was doing for all 81 years, including the last 18 months. I'm going to take care of what she left me. The house, the garden, the table with the burn mark, the photograph on the windowsill, the knowledge of where everything is and what everything means. The hydrangeas will be fine. There is one more thing I want to tell you, which is about a conversation I had with my mother in July, 3 months after Margaret died, and 2 months after the legal matters had been resolved without going to court. She called on a Sunday evening. I was in the garden, Margaret's garden, my garden now, cutting back some of the perennials that had gotten leggy in the summer heat. I had the pruning shears in my hand when the phone rang, and I set them down and I answered because I always answer, because that is one of the rules I hold to regardless of everything else. She said she wanted to talk. Not about the house, she had accepted, or at least she had stopped contesting. The fact of the house. About the 4 years, she said she had been thinking about the 4 years. She said, I didn't understand what you were doing. I said, what do you mean? She said, I thought you were just visiting. I didn't understand that you were taking care of things. Real things. I didn't understand how much there was. I sat down on the garden bench, the bench that had been there since the 1990s, wooden, slightly weathered, facing the hydrangeas. I said, it was a lot. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I should have been helping. I know that. I didn't let myself see how much there was because seeing it would have meant I had to do something about it. This was the most honest thing my mother had said to me in years, possibly in my adult life. I received it carefully, the way you receive things that are significant. I said, I know. She said, I'm not asking you to forgive me for the house. I know that's not how it works. I'm telling you that I understand now what you were doing and I think it mattered and I think she was right. I looked at the hydrangeas. They were full and heavy with late summer bloom, the blue-purple color that Margaret had always called the color of good news. She had told me that once that hydrangeas were the color of good news because when you see them blooming, it means the summer is still here, and the summer is still here is good news. I said it mattered to me too. Not just because of what happened after, it mattered while it was happening. She said, I know, that's the part I missed. We talked for another 20 minutes. Not resolutely, there is no resolution to this, not in a single conversation, or perhaps not at all. But honestly, in the way that requires both people to acknowledge something that is true, even when the truth is uncomfortable. My mother is 60 years old and she is not going to become a different kind of person. But she is, perhaps, going to understand something more fully than she did before. I hung up and picked up the pruning shears and went back to the perennials. The garden was warm and smelled like late summer, and the hydrangeas were exactly the color Margaret said they were. The color of good news. I'm still here. The house is still here. The garden is still here. She knew. She prepared. She gave me the time and the tools to take care of what she loved. That is the whole story. I want to tell you about one specific Saturday from the second year, because it is the Saturday I think about most when I think about what the 4 years were. It was November. Cold, gray, the specific Nashville November that has not yet decided to become winter. I drove down on a Saturday morning, and when I arrived, Margaret was in the kitchen making something she called winter soup, a loose category that included whatever vegetables needed to be used and some combination of beans in broth that varied every time. She did not look up when I came in. She said, "Get the rosemary from the windowsill." I got the rosemary. She said, "Chop it fine." I chopped it fine. We cooked together for 40 minutes without saying anything that was not about the soup. And then we sat down and ate it. And it was exactly right, the specific rightness of food made by two people who know each other's way of moving around a kitchen. After lunch, she asked me to help her with the hall closet, which had accumulated things over the summer that needed to be sorted before winter set in. We spent 2 hours going through boxes, Christmas decorations, old photographs, a collection of William's tools that she had never been able to move because moving them felt too final. She held his level for a while, the old wooden-handled one with the bubble in the center, and did not say anything, and I did not say anything either, and we stood in the hall closet together, in the specific silence of two people holding the same weight. Then she said, "Put that in the garage. Someone will want to use it someday." I put it in the garage. We finished the closet. We made tea. The afternoon came in gray and cold through the windows, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she told me about the winter she and William had spent 2 months in a house without heat, because the furnace had broken, and they could not afford to fix it, and they had heated the kitchen with the oven and slept in their coats, and she had thought it was the worst winter of her life. But looking back, it was the winter she was surest she had married the right person. I listened. I did not write anything down. I did not need to write it down. It is still in me, the way the things she told me are still in me, all of them, the 4 years of ordinary Saturdays and extraordinary ones, the soup and the closet and William's level and the specific quality of her voice when she told me about the winter without heat. I carry all of it. I carried it into her house when I moved in, and it lives there with me now, alongside the plants on the windowsill and the photograph and the burn mark on the table corner and the garden gloves in the garage. This is what I meant when I said showing up is not a sacrifice if you choose it. You carry what you receive back into the world with you. You are made incrementally out of the ordinary Saturdays you choose to spend in the right places with the right people. Margaret made me more fully myself over 4 years of unremarkable Saturdays than I would have been without them. That is the gift that runs in the other direction. That is the gift that does not go into a trust document, but that is perhaps the larger inheritance. She is gone. The house is here. The soup recipe is in a notebook in the kitchen drawer. I will make it this November: rosemary chopped fine. Whatever vegetables need to be used. Beans and broth in whatever combination seems right. It will be exactly right. Take care of whoever needs you to show up. They are watching. They are grateful in the ways they are able to be grateful. And somewhere in the months between when they understand what is coming and when it arrives, they may be preparing a way to say so. They see you. You are not invisible to the people whose life you have walked into. You are, in fact, the most visible person there. If you have been the one who shows up, the one who drives the 2 hours and learns the medical history and handles the things that no one else handles, hear this: what you are doing is real. It will not always be recognized in the moment. The people who benefit from your showing up are sometimes the people who are best positioned to ignore how much the showing up costs. But someone is watching, the person you are showing up for is watching, and they know, and they are doing what they can to say so. Sometimes what they can do is limited by the window that remains. Sometimes what they can do is file a document with a lawyer 18 months before they go, and instruct the lawyer to deliver it 9 days after, at a table in a house where the burn mark on the corner was made by a candle at the dinner party where your parents met. Take care of whoever is waiting for you to show up, and trust that what you give freely will find its way back to you, in the form it takes when someone who loves you has the time to prepare. Drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.